Hello, I'm Mark Payne. Welcome to History Live. History Live is a program of the West Virginia Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. These presentations are both entertaining and educational. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of civic groups. The presentation fee is paid by the council, and we ask only that their travel costs be covered by the host group. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Pearl Buck or Chief Logan come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures and make them seem more real. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. The presenters on our History Live roster have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It is very much an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio photojournalist Francis B Johnston.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here to speak with you this afternoon about my life and my career in photography. I was lecturing just last week at the Brooklyn chapter of the New York Camera Club, and someone asked me while I was there how many years had I been supporting myself as a photographer. And I was surprised to realize that this year marks the 25th year that I've been supporting myself through photography, and the 20th year that I have owned my own studio, beginning with my studio in my parents' home on V Street in Washington, D.C. in 1890. But let me begin at the beginning. You've asked me to talk about my very beginnings and my educational opportunities and how I worked myself into a career in photography and why I chose this as a career to support myself. I was born in Grafton, West Virginia in 1864. My parents were Anderson Johnston and Frances Antoinette Benjamin Johnston. And when I was just still a small baby, we moved from West Virginia to Rochester, New York, where my mother is from. And then thereafter, very shortly thereafter, we moved to Washington, D.C., where my father became the head bookkeeper for the Treasury Department. My mother worked all of her life as a lady correspondent for a number of newspapers, such as the Baltimore Sun, the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, and other Washington newspapers. She wrote mainly about politics and politicians, and she prided herself on her objectivity, and she was very well thought of and regarded as a lady correspondent. I spent my younger years in school in different Washington, D.C. schools and in Maryland. And then when I was 18, I traveled all the way to Paris to be accepted to the Académie Julienne to study art and drawing. And I spent 2 years in Paris, 2 wonderful years in Paris, and I do believe that that's where I began to have my love for travel and to explore. And when I returned to Washington, D.C., after 2 years, I began working as a teacher for the Student Art League. And there was another fellow teacher there who was leaving the area and asked me if I would like to take over her position that she had with Demarest Family Magazine as an illustrator for articles. I told her I'd be delighted to take over the position, and I did. It wasn't too long after I began as a hand illustrator for articles that I realized that with the new technology that was developed of halftone printing, that then magazines and newspapers could use photographs to illustrate their articles rather than hand illustrations. Well, I began to see the writing on the wall. I believed that this was what was going to be the coming thing, and I was most curious about photography. So I wrote to a family friend of ours, George Eastman, you may have heard of him, and I asked him for advice about photography. And by way of an answer, he sent me my very first Kodak box camera and advised me to find a photographer in the field to work with to learn how to photograph and to develop my own photographs. And I did. Through some contacts of my father's, I began to work with Mr. Thomas Smealy of the Smithsonian Institution, who was head of the photography department there, and he taught me how to use the camera, how to compose photographs, how to develop my own pictures, and it was a wonderful experience, as a matter of fact. So then I began photographing the articles, providing photographs for the articles that would appear in the magazines, and soon other magazines began to ask me to do the same thing, to provide the photographs. Then one day, my editor came to me and he said, "Why don't you try writing the article as well as photographing it?" And I was very intrigued by the idea, and so he wanted me to write and photograph an article about the United States Mint. And so I traveled to the Mint, and as a result, I wrote an article titled Uncle Sam's Money, and my photographs accompanied that. While that led to even more work with other magazines such as McClure's and Cosmopolitan and Harper's and Ladies' Home Journal. And then as I became more and progressed more and more with my photography, I was asked to curate photography exhibitions for different galleries in New York, and I was one of the official photographers for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and as a result of that, I was asked to curate an exhibition in the Paris World Fair in 1900 representing only lady photographers, and I'm proud to say that I represented there 28 lady photographers. And as a matter of fact, I took the gold medal for my photographs of the Washington, D.C. schools and the Hampton Institution School. About 13 years ago, as a matter of fact, I wrote an article for Harper's Magazine, for Ladies' Home Journal magazine, titled What a Woman Can Do with a Camera. By that time, I had enough expertise and experience that told me what would be required of any woman who would like to become a photographer, and I came up with some certain characteristics that I feel that any woman who wants to support herself in the career of photography should consider. And one of the first characteristics that a woman should consider is that of being willing to break with convention. My generation and all the generations of ladies before me usually are limited to becoming a wife and a mother, and these are fine endeavors. But most of the other professions were excluded to we women, and I was determined that no profession that was formerly considered a man's profession was going to be excluded to me, and photography was my way of breaking with convention, breaking into the world of photography. The other way that I feel a woman can break with convention is that when she does her photography, she can travel into domains and areas that were formerly only male, and that's exactly what I did. As an example, the editor of my magazine asked me if I would be willing to travel to Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, to photograph the Cohen Moore mine, coal mine, underground of course, and I was faced with two immediate problems. Number one, as a general rule, coal miners don't like for women to come down into the mines because they have a superstition that it is bad luck. Fortunately for me, my editor and the owner of the coal mine worked together and facilitated me so that I could go down into the mine to photograph. The other thing is, and this is where the Kodak box camera came in very handy. Previously, photographic equipment could weigh anywhere upwards of 70 to 80 pounds. With the Kodak box camera weighing only a few pounds, any woman can take all of her photographic equipment with her. And so I went down into the mines, but then there was another more important and pressing problem when I was down there. It's not unheard of for an odorless gas called methane to come into the caves where the men are working, and it can be very deadly. It can be especially deadly if there is any spark or small explosion in the cave at the time when methane gas is there. So because we photographers use flash powder in a tray to illuminate the scene so that we can photograph, such as underground, I had to calculate just how small amount of flash powder that I could use and hopefully not set off an explosion if there should have been any methane gas there. And so I calculated what was the smallest amount that I could get away with and still illuminate it enough and so that you could see the photographs. And I'm glad to say I'm here today, and it worked. And I turned out some very beautiful photographs for the coal mines. And another time that I went underground, it wasn't as dangerous, but I traveled to Mammoth Caves in Kentucky with some girlfriends of mine in order to photograph the caves. But one of the most delightful things that happened while I was there was the proprietor of the caves recommended that we ladies change out of our skirts and dresses, which are rather cumbersome to travel through undeveloped caves, and change into bloomer costumes. And I was absolutely delighted with these. I think women should wear them all the time, so that I was as unencumbered as any man who was moving about the caves. And we ladies had the best time exploring the caves in our bloomers. There is another characteristic that I think photographers need to consider, and that is one of a good sense of taste. And what I mean by that is, when I studied art at the Académie Julian in Paris, I learned how to compose an artful setting. And I think that's important with photography as well. But I don't want to give the impression that you have to go through formal education in order to be able to artfully compose a photograph. I don't mean that at all. You can certainly work in the field, and also you can travel to exhibits and galleries and look at photographs there to see how successful photographers have composed their pictures. And another thing that I think is very important characteristic is that you must be very sensitive to whomever is on the other side of the lens and try to capture their very nature. And it is my belief that whoever is on the other side of the lens from me has every bit as much dignity as I do. Another characteristic is one of unlimited tact, and I can certainly attest to this. Most journalists refer to me as the American court photographer, and that is because I have photographed 5 sitting presidents, beginning with President Cleveland and President Harrison, President McKinley, President Roosevelt, and the current President Taft. They have allowed me into the White House due to some family and work connections, and I've been able to photograph the presidents and their families in the White House. And believe me, that takes a great deal of tact to do that and do it correctly. People in public, in power, have special needs and special concerns, and you have to be very mindful of what those are in order to photograph them correctly. For example, with President Roosevelt, I was able to photograph his children even though he didn't want to because they were terribly spoiled. Sometimes there are some very exciting adventures that I go on, like the time that I photographed Admiral Dewey aboard the USS Olympia. There was the time that I traveled to Tuskegee Institution to photograph that institution as progressive education, and I traveled to one of the little Tuskegees in Raymer, Alabama, and While I was there, I had traveled down on the train with George Washington Carver, and when I got off at the depot, I was in the company of Mr. Carver and Mr. Henry, the principal of the Tuskegee in Raymer, Alabama. And some local folks didn't like that, and so we had to run for our lives because they wanted to lynch Mr. Carver and Mr. Henry. And we escaped under cover of night. And later on, Mr. Carver said, "I do believe Miss Johnston is the pluckiest woman I ever saw," but it certainly was a scary situation. One of the driving principles of my life and in my career is that I believe every man and woman is responsible for his or her life. And I have tried to do that. It has been very important for me to support myself through my own career, and I have surrounded myself with supporting family and friends. And I believe that my art and my photography stands as a testimony to those endeavors. I thank you, everyone, for inviting me here.
We're back with Miss Francis B Johnston, photojournalist. Ms. Johnston, I'd like to thank you for being with us here today.
Well, thank you.
During your presentation just a few moments ago, you mentioned your time at the Julian Academy in Paris. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience there in Paris and how you came to wind up at the Academy?
Well, certainly. Well, a number of our family friends in Washington, D.C. were sending their children to various academies in Europe. And I had the opportunity to attend the Académie Julian in Paris to study art, which was my interest throughout high school. And so I traveled over to Paris and I spent 2 years there studying art and drawing. And only a few years before that, women were even allowed to attend the Academy. And even at that, we had to pay twice what the men paid who attended the Academy. But one of the most...
Why did you have to pay twice?
Well, they wanted to believe that the women would be serious. You know, we were newly students in the academies, and they wanted to make sure we were very serious about our careers as artists and our attendance at the Academy.
How do you think that your studies and your training there at the Academy influenced some of your later work and your approach to your photography, for instance?
I believe it taught me artistic concerns, aesthetics, such as when I would compose a photograph, I would think about when I was going to make a drawing or when I was going to paint a painting. And you consider light and shadow and composition and balance and what's in the foreground, what's in the background. And that all applies to photography, which we now believe is an art. It's been a long struggle to get photography considered as an art, but I certainly believe that it is.
You also mentioned that and I think that it was a good comment that you made, that a photographer should certainly be mindful of the people and sensitive to the folks on the other side of the camera.
Yes.
And be aware of some of the considerations of the people that you're photographing. Mm-hmm. How do you go about that? How do you prepare for someone? You have photographed presidents and
yes.
other very important persons. Is there a particular way that you prepare?
Well, certainly if it's a public figure, I already know a good deal about them because they've been in magazines and newspapers and I can read about their interests. But I'll give you a good example with Joel Chandler Harris. You might know him as the author of Uncle Remus stories. He's very reclusive, and I wanted to photograph him, and I tracked him down at his snap bean farm in Georgia, and he didn't want his photograph taken, but I thought he would make a wonderful subject. But I sat down with him on his porch and we talked about gardening for some time, and that relaxed him. So one of the things I try to do is find out what is the interest of the subject and talk to them about it if I can, and that relaxes them, and that makes for a much better photograph.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you were fortunate enough to have your first camera. You obtained it from George Eastman.
Yes.
Which is not a bad contact if
No,
you want to get a camera.
not at all.
How did you end up getting your camera from Mr. Eastman?
Mr. Eastman is from Rochester, New York, as is my mother, and our families knew one another, so it was natural for me to write to him and ask him about photography. Who better to ask than George Eastman? And so that's how I came in contact with Mr. Eastman, and he sent me a camera. And
you also got some training from the head of photography at the Smithsonian Institution,
yes,
which is
yes.
not bad.
Well, my father being in government as the head bookkeeper for the Treasury Department, knew a number of people in government, and through some associations, I contacted Mr. Smealy, and he was willing to help me learn photography.
I have to ask you a couple of questions that are a little simple, I guess, but what is your favorite subject to photograph?
Well, my favorite subject to photograph, one of my favorite subjects to photograph was Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, because she was someone in the White House who exemplified for the American people dignity and grace and qualities that all of us could aspire to. I sold more photographs of Alice Roosevelt than anybody else other than President McKinley. It was a widely popular photograph. And
to what do you attribute that popularity of photograph?
Well, Alice was just such a beautiful, elegant-looking lady, and at that time, people wanted to emulate her, wanted to be like her.
So on the flip side of that, who was the most difficult person for you to photograph?
It was difficult, Susan B. Anthony, because she's a lovely lady. I don't mean that she was difficult in the sense that, but she was very self-conscious about an eye condition that she had. And as a matter of fact, I was the first photographer that was permitted to photograph her from face on. Everything else had been from profile because of her trouble with her eye. But I was able to relax her and to convince her that no one would think any less of her if we could see her face on. So it took me a while to convince her.
Was she satisfied with the
Yes, she was.
The
she was she was very happy with it. I was very pleased that she ordered a number of photographs of herself.
I understand that you once belonged to a rather unusual group when you had your studio in Washington, D.C. that was called The Push.
Yes.
Can you share with us a little bit about what The Push was?
Yes, well, I learned when I was in Paris that it was very important to surround yourself with your creative friends, because that's what you could talk about and help one another with. So on Wednesday evenings in my studio, I invited over some photography and artist friends, and we would get together and we would help one another with jobs, other photographic opportunities. New photographers, we would talk to them about the business and to help them, facilitate them into that career. And also to be creative, we would also dress up in silly costumes and take photographs of one another. And we called ourselves The Push. There's a term in photography called pushing and exposure, which means pushing it to a higher development. And we felt that that's what we did with one another, pushed one another to better exposures.
About how many members were involved?
At peak, there were probably about 30.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
men and women.
At this point, I would like to introduce you to the presenter of Francis B. Johnston, who is this is Cathy Pleska of Scott Depot,
yes.
West Virginia.
Hello.
Hi, Cathy. It's
Hi.
Nice of you to be here with us.
Thank you.
And Cathy is one of the newer roster members on our History Live program, so we're really glad that you're on the roster with us now.
Thank you.
But I'm going to ask you what I ask everyone that's been on this show, which is, what was it about this particular character that compelled you to do the research and want to do historical characterization of her?
I actually hadn't thought about it until a friend of mine, an author friend of mine, Belinda Anderson, suggested I might make, because of my outgoing personality, I suppose, might make a good History Alive character. And she forwarded me an article about Francis B. Johnston written by Gerald Swick for the Clarksburg newspaper. And it was a brief article, but it intrigued me about Francis because she seemed to have this dual personality. Here on one hand, she was very businesslike and very successful in selling her photographs. But on the other hand, she was very bohemian. And I love that complexity about the character, about the person. And she was so prodigious in her work, in her photography. I mean, 25,000 photographs are on in the Library of Congress, and 19,000 pieces of written work. And I thought, this is a lady who needs to be rediscovered. And then I saw her self-portrait of her sitting with her skirts hiked up and her slips showing, a cigarette in one hand and a beer stein in the other, and this was in 1895. And so I thought, I want to know this lady.
She was a bit progressive.
Oh, very progressive. She was very progressive.
So what were the sources that you used and that you went to when you were researching her to develop your presentation?
One of my main sources was a biography done on her back in 2001 by Bettina Birch. It's very thorough scholarly work on Francis, and there are a number of scholarly articles I found on the internet, and I also traveled to the Library of Congress to observe her diaries and her written works that she wrote, Francis herself wrote. And so I was able to get a real sense at that point of her personality as well.
Now, I know that later, or at one point in her career, she was pretty important in documenting important American architecture.
Yes.
Do you know when she started into this phase of her career and why?
Yes. She had spent a number of years as a photographer out in the field, photographing schools like the Hampton Institution and Tuskegee and this sort of thing. So she was very interested in documentary type work from the very beginning, as well as portraiture work in her studio. Around 1910, which is when I stopped her in time, she was just beginning to be interested in estate and garden photography. And from that, people would say, well, why don't you come in my home and photograph that? Carnegie Mellon, about 1913, 1913, was interested in preserving, through documentary photography, architecture throughout the South, which was rapidly disappearing. And we're talking a couple of 100 years old, and they were being destroyed. And so she applied for 3 different fellowships and was able to travel throughout the South, and that formed the base for the historic preservation that later formed in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and she donated all of those photographs to the library?
Everything, yes. 25,000 photographs is all donated to. She had no children. She never married. She didn't have any siblings. She had 3 siblings, all who died in infancy. And so there really were no family members remaining to pass these on to. Plus, she wanted it. It was very important to her that it be left to the public for posterity and for historical reasons.
And she was born in Grafton, but spent very little time.
Oh, she was an infant when she left.
And she didn't, do you know, did she ever come back to West Virginia? Or
not that I know of, although she probably traveled through it. I do understand there are some photographs that exist that she took of Blennerhassett Island. So it's very possible that she traveled across West Virginia to get there, but there's no indication yet that she visited West Virginia any length of time.
And I know we've got about another minute to go here, but what can you tell us about the last years of her life? Where did her work go? I mean, what was she interested in doing, and how did she pursue that? She
actually pursued the architectural photography for over 30 years, and about the last 10 years of her life, she moved to New Orleans because she loved the idea of passing out her final years in a bohemian community. And she died in New Orleans at the age of 88, natural causes, in the year 1952. So in the last 10 years, she was too ill or too infirm to do any photography. But she certainly enjoyed her bohemian life in the last few years.
Okay. Well, Cathy, I want to thank you again
certainly
for taking time out of your schedule to be with us here. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in and watching History Alive.